In a warehouse in Germany are the remnants of some of the lessons taught by the new machine age. These are the first ever examples of a domestic fitted kitchen, designed by the Austrian architect Margareta Schütte-Lehoczky.
Margarete was not very fond of cooking, and she always said, I even can't make a coffee. So she didn't like cooking very much, but she designed the kitchen very carefully.
Margaret came in with this radical idea, which is now known as the Frankfurt kitchen, which was basically the first really mass-produced fitted kitchen. The idea that she had was to rationalise women's work.
Schütte-Lehoczky's inspiration came from the galley kitchens of transcontinental trains. But she backed it up with ideas borrowed from the latest management thinking from America. It was there in 1910 that Frank and Lillian Gilbreth had first used a movie camera to record and analyze the movements of factory and office workers. They reduced them to 18 basic motions, which then became the starting point for the design and layout of tools and equipment. These time and motion studies became one of the basic tools of ergonomics, which roughly translates as the laws of work, a subject Schütte-Lehoczky was passionately interested in.
Margaret was a communist. You know, her idea was that you would free women from the drudgery of domestic work so that they could go and work down the factory, and that in itself was liberating. And actually, Margaret herself was around with a stopwatch and kind of studying how women worked in a kitchen and how it could be improved, you know, trying to reduce the number of steps that people took from the stove to the sink and so on. And so she created this very rational kitchen, which at the time, the idea of the galley kitchen was very radical.
So this is one of Margarete Schütte-Lehoczky's Frankfurt kitchens. You have the aluminum bins, and when you take these aluminum bills, you pour flour into this bin, and then you put it back. In this part you have the cupboard with sliding doors. This is the cooking box, and when you put a boiling soup inside, it continues boiling, and after 1 hour or 2 is ready to serve. This ironing board is fixed to the wall, and it comes down, and it already had been used. It looks quite dangerous.
10,000 of her kitchens were installed in a large-scale social housing development in Frankfurt am Main. But despite all of the well-laid plans, many first-time users were apparently baffled by the layout. They found the inflexibility of the design frustrating, and they proved to be disappointingly undisciplined when it came to using the carefully labelled food bins.
When people actually went in to use the Frankfurt kitchen, there were many things that were great about it. Yep, it was very efficient and white clean and very functional, but people found them very cold. There were a lot of responses to it that it was very sort of alien. And yeah, it was like a factory. It was like a kind of a kind of galley kitchen from a ship. It was very pokey. I mean, it's a very small, it's sort of 3 meters by 2.5 meters. Very, very small. There was barely room for, one person to work in there, let alone the 2 that Margaret had envisaged.
I look at kitchens today, and I mean, you can see where those have come from. They've come from those old ideas that we want to have everything kind of neatly organised, and we want it to function well, and we want to be able to serve our family in a way that actually makes sense. But who's to tell me where I keep my bread? Half the time we keep our bread in the microwave, you know, because it's the only storage place that will keep it dry. That idea of imposing a vision on somebody and expecting them to live up to it is an absolutely impossible dream for any designer. So, you know, I always say this to our clients, you need to create something that's adaptive, you need to build in flexibility, and you need to allow the person their right to customize the experience that you're creating for them.
But designs for living weren't just confined to the kitchen. In Wiesenhof, a suburb of Stuttgart, the city council offered designers and architects a larger canvas, a whole estate of houses, show homes of the future.
So this was a kind of very radical thing for the city of Stuttgart to do. And they rounded up the kind of the real young guns of architecture. You know, it was a kind of a who's who of people in their 30s and early 40s. You know, you had Bruno Taut, you had Mies van der Rohe, you had Walter Gropius, you had Le Corbusier. All the, you know, the hot stars of the time were invited to build this model village. You know, at the time, Germany was going through a massive housing crisis. And you had workers' housing going up all over the country. Well, this was Stuttgart's attempt to show, well, you know, this is the way it should be. You go there now and you think, blimey, if these were built now, they would still be regarded as radically modern, let alone in the mid-20s. You know, these beautiful cubist blocks right up on the hillside.
The double house on Rathenaustrasse was designed by the Swiss-born architect Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier's design went one step further than the fitted kitchen. This was a fitted house, and the architect had thought long and hard about how the modern family would fit into it.
Corbusier's idea was to divide space up into served and servant spaces. So over here we've got the bathroom down in the corner, which is not the kind of bathroom you want to hang out in. It's the kind of bathroom you just want to go and have a quick shave in. Here we have a kitchen area, which is sort of very much a kind of area where your maid would be there serving you if you're having your lunch out here in the kind of living, dining space. The whole idea was to shift all the kind of servant spaces, the kind of spaces for drudgery, make them as small and as remote as possible, and open up space for living, for being entertained, for leisure pursuits, I suppose, essentially. So complete division, oil and water. You know, this was a machine for living in.
Like the fitted kitchen, the fitted house took its inspiration from outside the domestic sphere.
Le Corbusier built this corridor with the same measures of a train's corridor, so it's 60 centimeters and the height of 2 meters and 5, like in each train at this time. And so it's a very theoretical corridor, but it's very important to connect his house with the train. So it's a modern traffic machine, so it stands for engineering and it stands for future.
Le Corbusier's obsession with the machine was that it was liberating. It would be liberating, it would free you. So you could literally adjust the interior to suit your life. You could transform it. The idea that a house could be flexible, could change in the future.
We are now in the living room, and you can change this room for the night use into sleeping compartments. You bring the bed out, or pull the bed out of the built-in cupboard, and you can bring out the second bed for the couple here, and then you can close the sliding wall to separate the sleeping room of the child from the sleeping room of the parents.
Now that gave immense freedom. It meant that both the architect and also the inhabitant of the house could shift the arrangement of the interior, the plan, to whatever they wanted to do. There's not much kind of running around the house. You know, everything's sort of kept very, very tight and close and efficient.
But freedom and flexibility came at a price. These were designs to live up to, rather than just live in.
He had these kind of slightly freakish views about communal living. He sort of had ideas that we should be living like students in a college or monks in a monastery, that actually our private space should be actually very, very small, and we should be sharing our communal space with lots of other people, and actually living like an artist, like he lived, actually.
In a sense, Le Corbusier never got over his potty training period emotionally as a Swiss designer, complete control freak, who wanted to tidy the world up.
The problem is that might have been fine for a few people, but it actually wasn't a solution for mass society. People actually liked their private space, actually. They liked to retreat as well as hang out on sun terraces.
I mean, modernism is always about enormous expectation, you know, and provocation mixed with disappointment.
The term is correct, modernism. It is a poetic reflection of the modern age. So you bend a steel tube and you stretch some canvas and you've got a modern object, hence a functional object. But they weren't all functional. I have a lot of Bauhaus furniture in my house. It is, without exception, none of it is comfortable. I don't sit in those chairs very often. I sit in a comfortable chair and look at those chairs. And that's basically what they're for, is to look at.
A lot of the modernists were prescribing how, not just how you would sit, but also how you would live. And that's what got us into trouble. Corbusier's original plan for Paris was to wipe out the old Paris and start new with these ridiculous towers with cars connecting everybody in between. It's a nightmare. This was his vision. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of cities started doing. And we are now repairing ourselves from this era. Corbusier's vision was very destructive. Now, he had some great designs for furniture and actually some interesting houses. And if he had only stuck to that, we would have all been better off.
The modernists had set out to break down the barriers that separated creative disciplines. But as the city-sized ambitions of Le Corbusier made clear, there is a fundamental distinction between architecture and design, as well as between architects and designers.
You've got to remember, architecture is big and heavy and slow and takes a lot of money to build. Design can respond much more quickly to changes in people's desires. It's basically more nimble, it's lighter, it's smaller. It's easier to do, frankly, than architecture. It's easier to change, you know, your chairs and your furniture than it is to change your building and a whole way of life and a whole environment.
But it's not just a difference in scale and speed. There's also a question of temperament.
We talk about designers as T-shaped beings, which means that you have a depth in something, you have a downstroke in something, a depth in craft, but a breadth and an empathy towards a lot of other disciplines. But I often think of architects as more maybe I-shaped. It's a depth in craft and less of a breadth in empathy. Architecture can often be quite a sort of solitary, visionary pursuit, and I don't think design works like that. We're not the guru in the atelier.
As the roaring 20s gave way to the low, dishonest decade that was the 1930s, the political context in mainland Europe changed dramatically. For architects, for designers, for everyone, the change was not for the better. In 1932, the Bauhaus closed its school in Dessau as the local branch of the Nazi Party flexed its brown-shirted muscle. Bauhaus founder Walter Gropius moved to Britain. He came here, the Isokon Flats in Hampstead, designed by architect Wells Coates. Alongside Gropius in the minimalist service flats with their communal dining room was fellow Bauhauser Marcel Breuer. Also resident was crime writer Agatha Christie, who likened their new home to a giant ocean liner. But this was not the typical face of modern Britain in the 1930s. Just a few miles from the Isakon Flats is the Holly Lodge estate, where high-rise living was half-timbered, and ocean liners was something to see the world in, rather than to live in.
This is what people wanted. This is how people wanted to live. Modernism, you could say, was trying to be a little bit too clever sometimes, a little bit too pared down, too simple. And that was very cool and stylish if you were into that kind of thing. But frankly, most people weren't.
Begun in the mid-1920s and added to throughout the 30s, the Holly Lodge estate was an alternative response to the demands of living in the modern world.
This is a typical housing estate from the 1930s. Each one of these is a little castle. It's the Englishman's castle. It's the epitome of that. It meant that you were living out the old English idyll. Everyone wants to live in a thatched cottage or a wonderful hammer-beamed Jacobean house, and that's exactly what these houses gave you the impression that you were doing. After the First World War, there was a longing to return to the pre-war period. After all, that was such a golden age. For a lot of people, technological progress began to be seen with great skepticism and fear, and that comes out in architecture and the way people live. Just at this time, what do we invent? We get the three-piece suite. And that says it all about what we're really interested in at that time. It's all about comfort.
This was also the moment when second-hand rebranded itself as antique. Hampered by death duties and plagued by the lack of servants to clean and polish, the great and good had, since the end of the Great War, been selling off the family silver, as well as the family mahogany. For the aspiring British middle class, a timeless classic with aristocratic connections trumped tubular steel with modernist pretensions.
And of course the houses also were full of provision for ornaments, for little details of living as well. The fireplace, the mantelpiece retained its sort of iconic status as one of these. You had this provision, this shelf for all of your ornaments, for your household goods, for your little status symbols, and for your heirlooms. And if you didn't have heirlooms, you could just go out and buy some.
Alongside the mock Tudor, there was mockery too. Cartoonist Heath Robinson poked gentle fun at the modernist lifestyle in his book, How to Live in a Flat.
Here you have wildly exaggerated modernism, the most outrageous, completely unmodernist, let's face it, arrangement of sort of spaghetti junction of chromed steel. On the other hand, you have two very traditional couples who look like they've just come back from the theatre or something, and with all the accoutrements of upper-class formal dining. So, of course, the two, never the twain would have met, but in fact, by parodying them, by contrasting them, and showing them up against this uncomfortable furniture, we have the absurdity of modernity in the eyes of the traditional establishment. I think one of the big objections to modernism from people like Keith Robinson or the satirists, or even the people that made serious objections, was the fact that they didn't like being told what to do. The British don't like that. We don't like being told what to do.